Okay, and now we will get started. Please welcome Jasmin DeCourcey, a proud master gardener from the class of 2018. Her journey into gardening began after the devastating derecho of August 2012, which left her without refrigeration for 4 days and sparked a deep passion for growing her own food and preserving it without relying on modern conveniences. As the longtime lead gardener at the Fairlington Small Garden, she honed her skills in year-round food production and discovered the joys of experimenting with sustainable techniques. One of her favorite hobbies and something she loves sharing with others is the art of winter sowing. Today, she's here to guide us through this fascinating and rewarding method of gardening. And now, Jasmin, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Nicole. Winter sewing hits a couple of my buttons. One is I'm invariably a cheapskate, and the other is I enjoy plants and watching them grow. And I'm too old to have babies now, so winter sewing allows me to have plant babies. That's a weird reason, but it's mine. So there are best management practices regardless of what we're teaching, and I want to explain what those are. The office has soil tests available. It's for a very nominal cost, and it's important that you know what the soil is telling you and what you should expect from it and what it needs in order to grow the best plants possible. You don't want compacted soil. You want it to have drainage. So make sure that it has lots of good organic matter. You can get this organic matter by planting cover crops in the winter or early spring, and it's called green manure. When we were training as master gardeners, they really honed in this phrase, right plant, right place. All plants have the best place for them to grow. So if you're finding that your plant is struggling, you might want to think about planting it somewhere else. When you're buying plants or looking at seeds, you want to look at those plants that are resistant to disease. There are heartbreaking plants that I'm sure you're aware of, like tomatoes that get all kinds of stuff. So definitely look at the little plastic thing they put in the plants or what they've indicated on the seed package that have your strongest plant possible. In addition to doing that, you should think about companion planting. I used to plant a certain type of flowers next to my tomatoes because they would keep the bugs away. Those are the type of things I'm talking about. You're going to learn over time, if you don't research ahead of time, what insects in your garden are good and that are not so good. You should be able to recognize them so that you don't get rid of the good ones. And the last one here is don't plant the same thing in the same place every year because they're drawing from the same nutrients. Rotate your crops so that they're having an advantage of enjoying the soil climate that you have where you're planting them new that particular year. So as gardeners, we have schedules of what we should be doing every part of the year. And for now, we normally don't do a whole lot of planting. We do a ton of planning. And we look at seed catalogs, we're growing things indoors, and we're starting to pick what will do best for winter sowing. And I'll explain where the sweet spots are in February, March, and April for winter sowing various plants. So in this particular talk, I'm going to talk about the growing season in our area, options to obtain plants, selecting the type of seeds and how to grow them, figuring in what the germination requirements are, using the winter sowing method, how to manage and transplant your seedlings once they take off, and how to make your own winter sown container. So in Northern Virginia, we were in zone 8A. And that gives us some extremes in cold and sustained heat, depending on the season. But it's good to know wherever you live, what zone that you live in, because when you're planning your garden and looking at seed catalogs and going to big box stores for plants, they'll say what area is best to grow them in. And so it's good to know what yours is. Our growing season here is approximately 36 weeks, which I think is pretty good. The average killing frost will be around mid-March, and the first one will be about mid-November in this area. Most of the vegetables that we love, the ones that grow in the summer, will be killed by frost. There are some vegetables that are resistant or have a lower threshold for dying from frost, and we'll talk a little bit about those. And in addition to choosing vegetables that have a lower threshold, you can also use things like you see the picture here, like a hoop house or other names for some sort of covering to provide 4 to 6 degrees of protection. So I would highly recommend having a copy of this planting guide around when you're deciding what to grow when. The purple is when to plant, the green is when to harvest, and if you're super ambitious, you can see when you can start planting some of those crops again and harvesting. So this is a very good guide. And something that you can tell is those things that do well early are on the upper left-hand side. Your collards, onions, peas, radish, spinach, turnips. These are good to plant early. Now, of those, things that you can winter sow are things that, one, don't have a taproot. So things like radishes are out, turnips are out because that's not good for winter sowing. Peas don't like to be moved. So they're very root sensitive. So I wouldn't recommend that for winter sowing, but I would recommend collards and spinach and beets and cabbage, not carrots because of their taproot. Some lettuce, you really have to look at the type of cultivar of lettuce because some of them are more hardy than others. But the idea here is that of those things that I listed, you don't have to wait until March to winter sow them. You can take it back 4 to 6 weeks and start them outside. So as I mentioned on the previous page, there are plants that do well when it's cold and plants that do better when it's warm. So it behooves us to know which plants like what season best. So the ways you can get plants, you can see this picture is of a volunteer tomato. And it's always fun and a surprise in your garden when you see a tomato plant that has grown somewhere where it's not supposed to be as a volunteer. But there are other ways. You could direct sow into your garden when the temperature is right. You can get a head start by growing indoors, and there's advantages and disadvantages to that. Advantages, you can start early. Disadvantage is that you have to watch out that they don't get leggy. You have to turn them. They require what I will call babysitting, but I don't mind. And you need to harden them off. And what that means is they're used to the summer environment in your basement or wherever your setup is inside. You're creating a summer day. If you're going to take them outside, they need to get used to that weather. So it's back and forth, back and forth. So that's the downside to starting your plants indoors. This is the expensive side, buying seedlings, start plants from a garden center, or your friend gives you some, or a farmer's market. When I go to garden centers for plants, and I'm sure there's other people on the call that do the same thing, but I'm looking for doubles and I'm looking for triples. I'm looking for any mistake the grower made in leaving more than one plant so that I get a 50% off or whatever it is. That's the way I save money. And the way you get plants really depends on your budget and how much time you have to spend and what you like to grow. So what kind of seeds are good. How do you know a good seed from a bad one? So you need to know when you're looking at seeds what its hardiness is and what your heat zone is. And what type of soil do you have? Do you have a big raised bed or are you growing in containers? All of these things go into how you would grow things because of spacing. You also want to look at what grows well together as opposed to what repels the other or stunts a plant. Some people use their gardens to feed their families, some of them give them away or use them as family activity. When you get your seed packets, you really want to look at what's the size of it when it grows to maturity, how long it's going to take till you can start harvesting that wonderfulness, whether they're disease resistant. And you want to look at how long the seed is good for. You can see on the right here, these are average times. And for the most part, you should be able to use your seeds more than 1 year, with the exception of corn and onions, which only last a year. With Master Gardeners, we get a lot of seed that are donated to us because they're 1 year old. And we gladly take them to start our gardens and our demonstration gardens. And the reason I'm telling you this is one, you can also go to your local Virginia Cooperative Extension and see if they have any seeds for you. Also, I want you to consider that you don't have to use all your seeds in your packet, and they're going to more than likely last for more than a year or two. So if you buy seeds from a seed catalog, you will be getting that catalog and many others for a long time. They're fun to look through, but the cost does add up. Generally, they're free for the asking. You also can go to a website. This is what I'm talking about when looking at seed packets. You can see from this cilantro that it takes them more than a week to germinate, that they want to be about a fourth of an inch in the ground, 6 inches apart. They're going to grow about 2 feet. One thing about cilantro that you need to understand is that they like cool weather. Once it gets hot, then they're going to do something called bolting, which is they're going to want to go to seed. So the picture here shows when it's best in what part of the country to grow cilantro. So there's a ton of information on the backside of your seed packets. Here's another example with tomato. And what's really important here is you know the difference between a determinate and an indeterminate tomato. A determinate means it's going to be a bush variety. It's going to fruit once or twice, but mostly once in a small space. And it's best for containers or if you have a small space and don't have a large space. Indeterminate goes until the season change. It's one long vine, and you have to keep supporting it with stakes or whatever. And that's very important to know determinate and indeterminate for seeds. So you can see here too, it provides you plant space, row space, how long it takes to sprout, when you're going to see your first tomato. Some people can't wait and they go to a box store and they buy tomatoes already started, and that's perfectly fine. There are tips to planting tomatoes. You want to plant them deep. They're very hungry and thirsty plants. If you love tomatoes like I do, especially homegrown ones, you want to research what the best growing conditions and buy some that are resistant to some disease. Most of them should say. Another good thing to know about seeds is whether or not they're open pollinated or a hybrid. Open pollinated means that they're relying on wind or insects to go from one plant to another in order to create fruit. And when you see heirloom, that's open pollinated. Most of what we have at big box stores are hybrids, which are a cross of varieties, and they do this so that they're more disease resistant or they're going for flavor or if you want an early harvest. So these plants are not as good for collecting seed from them, which is a perfectly good idea. I get it, but you're not going to get a true to type if you are trying to collect seed from a hybrid. You are if the plant was open pollinated. Germination. The things that all plants need, some more than others, are light, moisture, temperature, and oxygen. Some require a lot of light and want to sit on the very top of the dirt, and some of them not so much. I have a temperature chart that shows you what the germination rates are best for different types of plants, and that should be very informative of when you should expect to see plants when you sow them. And here it is. Again, the tried and true for cold weather: beets, carrots, lettuce, parsley, radish, spinach are all early for germinating. And you can see over time that if it gets warmer, more plants germinate at higher temperatures. What winter sowing does is it creates a better germination temperature inside of the container. So things that are good here, the lettuce, the parsley, the spinach, the cabbage, the Swiss chard, these are very good winter sowing candidates and can take a little frost, and you are creating, at least for part of the day, the conditions they need for germinating. With winter sowing, you're creating a strong, hardy plant. You don't need to rotate it. You don't need to babysit it. You do need to make sure it's not dried out, but it's a lot less high maintenance and you get a strong plant from my experience. Questions so far?
One question that actually just popped up with the germination values chart is whether the values presented in that chart are for direct sowing and soil only, or are you talking about the containers and the variety of other settings that you can use with winter sowing?
This is direct into the ground. This is a very general germination chart. If you have a container, it's going to get warmer depending on how small or large the container is. But even more so with winter sowing, it's a very contained environment inside the milk jug. So you're getting up to 20 degrees warmer during the day in the winter sown container. So you can start earlier trying to germinate these colder plants. And for the warmer ones too, we can talk about that. So as the days get warmer and you don't have, then you can start planting winter sowing your tenders, your peppers, your tomatoes, but you have to be careful because these type of warmer plants are not frost tolerant. So if you have a winter sown pepper or tomato and it freezes, the plant will not survive unless you cover it or bring it inside for the night. You need to be mindful, but this is a very good method if you want to perennial flowers, because a lot of those seeds need to be frozen and unfrozen, frozen and unfrozen in order to crack the seed shell. This doesn't particularly speak to flowers, but for perennials, I would definitely start winter sowing them this month even.
We have a couple more questions that have come in. One is about radishes and whether radishes transplant well.
They do not.
Because they're a root, I'm guessing, same like with the
Yeah,
carrots. And then we have a question about transplanting. Transplanting root seeds or cuttings from mint and basil. Can these be transplanted early outside if I use a cloche?
I love using cloches. I even love the word cloche. They said mint. Mint is a super plant, okay? I would never plant mint in the open because it wants to take over the planet, but definitely in a container so that you can control it. Basil loves warmth. Yes, but that's a tender plant and I would watch out for frost. Less or so with mint. Mint is, as I said, it's pretty strong. Most herbs are.
Another question we have is about nasturtium seeds and whether they need to be scarified if you're winter sowing.
They can go straight in.
Okay. We have another question about the germination chart that you used earlier with spinach, just clarifying the soil temperature and then the germination temperature. So the question is, Spinach can be planted in soil at 40 degrees and germinate at 70 degrees. They just wanted to be sure.
No, that's a very good question, and I didn't explain that, and I apologize. But this is the best time for them to germinate on the left, and when they start dying and can't take the heat anymore on the right. I wouldn't go any farther to the right than those optimal temperatures. But for the example of winter sowing, we're all interested in winter sowing because we want to start plants sooner. Most of these plants, the lettuces, the things that like cold, the cilantro, can be started early. And the warmer it gets, the less they like the soil temperature. So although it says it's optimal, I would argue that they probably wouldn't last long. They would want to go straight to maturity and seed. So the earlier the better, my recommendation.
I want to make sure that I'm understanding it properly. And so this is back to the herb and cloche question. The question is if you're taking cuttings that have been in water, and so you have the water roots as opposed to something that's been in seed and have soil roots. Part of the question is whether water roots are different than soil roots, or are they not considered true roots, and then how does that affect sowing and then transplanting?
Water roots are not the same, but you can transplant a plant that has water roots into soil with success.
One final question, I think, before we can move on is about winter sowing mustard seed, and is that possible?
Oh, yeah. Mustard seed is strong. So this is how hands off you need to be with your winter sowing. It's kind of like sow it and forget it. It doesn't matter if it rains, it snows, it's all good. Start this method. It's all about what you're trying to grow and the timing of what that plant likes the most. So essentially, these are mini greenhouses, and this is pennies on the dollar, the cheapest way to start your own nursery. And imagine how awesome it is to come outside and be able to see on your upper left-hand corner your plants ready to be transplanted. You didn't have to bring them out and back in to be hardened from being grown indoors. And a lot of seedlings suffer, especially ones that are grown indoors, from a fungus related issue called damping off. You will not get this issue with winter sowing. So, what's best to winter sow when? Now, I have started as early as January. It's kind of sketch to start that early, but I have hardy perennial flowers and plants that require stratification and those things that I mentioned that are frost tolerant vegetables. Growing now through early March are any herbs or frost tolerant vegetables, and those are mainly your leaf vegetables. When you start getting to the iffy zone is mid-March to April, when you have some days of frost, and you can start taking the risk of growing in mid-March to April your tender plants, your annual flowers, and your warm-loving vegetables. But you do need to protect them if you see the weather forecast indicating that frost is on the way. You can do that by bringing indoors. You can do that by covering them. There are a number of ways. Again, I don't recommend winter sowing anything with a tap root because you're going to get a funny looking vegetable. And if that doesn't matter to you, go for it. But there are also things that don't like to be moved once they're planted that I would only direct sow. And these are chard, beans, and peas. Selecting your containers. I heard before we started this class that somebody was winter sewing in Ziploc bags. I started mentally going over what would be the best Ziploc bag. I would think that it would be a half gallon. I want at least 3 or 4 inches of soil in there. It's definitely possible, and I love experimenting. But what I would worry with that is a couple of things. One is the durability of the plastic over time being outside. And I would want to make sure that the Ziploc bag stayed open on one end and that there was good airflow with that Ziploc bag. For the most part, my recommendation are clear juice containers and milk jugs. You see in this picture here a foil roasting pan. That's okay, but I do worry in those instances that it doesn't have a lot of real estate going up, whereas the milk jugs and the juice containers have a lot more vertical space. You want at least 3 inches of soil. My favorite is a gallon milk jug. The way that I prepare it is that I rinse it out. I cut along all outside container except for the handle because that provides a hinge. I make 4 to 6 slits at the bottom. I absolutely leave the cap off the container because I want it to get warm and cold in there, and I want them to have air transpiration. So I want to leave those caps off. That's important. Once I have the soil in there, then I soak and drain it well, and I let it sit for at least this is before I put any seeds in it, at least an hour so that it's not sopping at the bottom. What type of soil do I use? I like using soil that's for starting seedlings because it's very light. You can use potting soil. You can use your own soil. You can use vermiculite and peat and potting soil, anything that makes the soil light. Never, ever, ever use soil from outside because it has too many seeds in it from various plants around it. So you're going to get a lot of weeds. I do this with fresh soil. So how many seeds per container? It depends on how old the seed is. I've used seed that mostly is a few years old. I know when I winter sow it that I'm not going to get a good germination rate. I may get 50%. So I'm overseeding. If it's brand new seed and I've paid for it, I'm more cognizant of how many seeds I put in there. It also matters the type of plant and when it starts growing, how much room it needs, how many plants you want in your garden space, and how big are these seeds that you want to sow. You can see that there's various size here of seeds that people are showing. Again, you want to place these outdoors. It should be full to part sun. Okay. You might need to move it into more shade as time goes on with the thought that it's 20 degrees warmer inside those containers on a sunny day than it is outside. 30 degrees and sunny outside, 50 degrees during the warm part of the day inside your container. And think about those germination rates, and you're going to start getting germination. And those plants that are growing in there are going to get used to the growing conditions in there and are going to be stronger for it. For those that you're planting that are considered tender, your warmer crops that you're waiting, you want to throw a blanket over them. It says protect them from the wind, but when they're in those containers, they're pretty protected. What's important is that you check them every once in a while. First, it's fun to see things grow. And second, you don't want them to dry out. But how do you water them? There's a couple of ways. One, if you want to be kind, you place this container into a larger container that has water and let it soak it in. Nature's way is to rain on top of them. So, although I am considerate of how delicate the plant is inside and how small it is, I really don't mind pouring water over the tops. So, that's another way. When do you transplant them? You can see on the lower left-hand corner, the leaves that are rounded are not considered true leaves. Those are the first leaves that come out. The ones that are below them are true leaves. And that seedling is going to be strong enough to be transplanted into a larger pot or directly into your garden once they have 1 to 2 sets of those. So about 4 of those true seeds. Something I didn't mention before that I want to mention now is that once you seed them, I use some kind of duct tape, but you can put 2 holes between the slit of the container and tie them together with string. It doesn't need to be an exact tight seal. You can label them on top of the container or you can label them on the tape because I have come across plants where the outside is all faded off and I don't know what I've put in there. I put in a lollipop stick or something that allows me to identify what it is I planted inside, or use a little stick like from ice cream. You can see at the bottom, these are liter bottles. Those are also good for winter sowing in. When do you start planting out? Well, when the ground is warm enough to support your plant. When I separate my plants, I use the brownie method. I cut them into brownies. Depending on how well they've germinated, I may or may not separate them plant by plant. I may just say, may the best plant win, and put them in the ground like you see them here. It depends on your personal preference. And do watch out for slugs because in the spring, there's nothing a slug loves better than fresh baby leaves. I use crushed eggshells because it's like crossing barbed wire to get to the baby leaves. But there are other means to keep slugs away also. That's just the one I like. You might have a situation where your plants aren't ready or the ground is not ready for you to plant in. So you might want to up pot. And that's just taking it from one container to another. And this can provide them with better soil conditions. And if you see that it's root bound, like the bottom picture here, you want to break that up a bit so that they don't keep winding themselves around and around in their roots. Tips for successful planting. The best day to transplant is a cloudy, windless day because transplanting is the hardest day on a plant. It's best that they don't have to contend with hard sun or wind on the day they have to transition from one environment to another. You always want to make sure that the hole is deep enough to accommodate the roots. Tomatoes, you want to bury deep. I mentioned that earlier. Tomatoes are special because they're hungry and thirsty, and you want them to bury their roots deep so that they have a strong foundation. There are some that recommend handling seedlings by their leaves and not their stem or roots. And the idea here is that if you lose a leaf, you don't lose the plant. But if you break a stem or you damage the root, you might have a problem keeping that plant alive. That is a preference. You can transfer them as individual plants or as brownie pieces, whatever you like, and make sure that the media around each plant is watered gently and it's firm. Questions?
Yes, we've had a few questions come up in the chat during this second section, mostly about containers. One is about yogurt containers and whether those are okay or must it be something that's clear on all sides.
It can be opaque. Some yogurt containers are opaque, but I want enough light to come through. So I would recommend nothing that keeps out light more than a milk jug would. Milk jugs and clear containers are your best bet.
And then we had another question with containers where this gardener has put several holes on the top of the container and wants to know if they should still remove the cap from the container as well.
If you think that the holes in your container equal the hole that the lid would provide, then okay. But I would say it's much easier just to leave the cap off than to make holes on the top and the bottom. But I can see how that might work.
And then this is a clarification question. You did mention a little while ago about sealing the container top open and just, what exactly do you mean by that? And if you could just be a little bit more clear about this.
Okay. When I meant sealing, I meant when you cut all the way around the milk jug, except for the hinge, is that you want to close it once you've planted your seeds in it. I usually use duct tape. It doesn't need to be a perfect seal, but it helps create the warmer environment during the day. You're still keeping the cap off of the top of it, but essentially you're making a small greenhouse.
And now we have some questions about when you're taking out from the container. So one is just very simple. Like, how do you use the brownie method with, say, a milk jug or something that has a narrower top? Are you cutting the whole container? Is there a way to get it out without cutting the container so that you can reuse
Uh-huh.
it?
Good questions. Okay. So first, I've already have the container cut in the middle of it, except for one piece that's a hinge. So when the plant is ready, I'm removing the duct tape. I'm opening the slit that I originally put in it, and then I'm putting it upside down with my fingers supporting the dirt, and I'm prying it loose from the container on top. Pat, 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 or scrunch, scrunch. And then what I have is a wad of dirt with plants on it. At that point, I'm separating by plant or doing brownie method.
And when you are planting them, and you mentioned the eggshells as like a type of barbed wire, how far is it from the plant? Like, how big is the perimeter? Just a little bit more detail on that.
Well, first, let me say that slugs are very determined. They can cross over a knife blade if they wanted to. They just have to exude a lot of their own goo in order to do it and not damage themselves. When you're warding off, it doesn't need to be, I would say, even more than 2 or 3 inches. They're going to go for plants that are less trouble. So if you're creating that row of barbed wire, I would just sprinkle it around the plant and you're good. That's just my opinion, though. Lots of gardeners have their own opinions.
Yes, yes. A lot of them are coming up in the chat. Some other questions just about containers again. One is whether you can reuse them or not. And
I have. I have reused them, but plastic degrades.
a question about if you've ever tried large clear storage containers with solo cups or other smaller containers and the larger container with a lid.
Okay, let's take that a piece at a time. Solo cups are red. Are solo cups clear?
I
Are
always
some
think of
solo
them as
cups
red.
clear?
You can get some that may not be solo brand, but they're solo type that are clear. You can get large cups like that, large plastic cups.
Okay, so if I was going to do it in a cup, there are considerations. I want 2 cups, 1 cup on the bottom, 1 cup at the top, because I want some room to grow up. I want a hole at the top for air transpiration. That would require a lot of looking because there is just such a confined space for the plant. I like more real estate. So I understand that's what that one person wants to use, but I would say definitely keep an eye on those. What are the other examples?
Other smaller containers in the larger container. So almost like, say you have one big container and you have the cups inside. So they're like little
Uh-huh.
mini pots inside a larger container, but instead of pots, they're just like little plastic cups inside a larger sort of plastic bin.
Interesting. Interesting. So what's going on top of that? Like, is this like so I'm envisioning a roasting pan and the lid would be clear and it have holes in it so that it would allow airflow. So yeah, that's possible.
Another question is there a way to do this without plastic? Maybe glass or something, because you need the translucency, I suppose. You have experience with non-plastic setups.
Yes, I have, but it needs to be clear and it needs to allow airflow. And glass, I'd have to keep an eye on because I would need to make sure it doesn't get too hot. Glass retains heat a bit more than plastic would, so that would be my only consideration.
One question about the tops is whether you leave the tops off all the time, even when it's raining heavily.
Yes, it's sort of a tough love type of attitude I have with winter sowing. Whatever nature brings, bring it. Okay, because that's what they're going to have to deal with anyway. They're being protected for the most part inside of the container, except for one spot. I'm all for saying, I dare you to do your best in that winter sowing container.
Another question we have is about soil and whether you recommend seed starting mix or potting mix.
Seed
Or
starting mix.
seed starting?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Only because it's lighter. But if all you have is potting soil, I would use that. You might want to make it lighter with an additive like vermiculite or perlite. because that's what all seed starting soil is really, is just lighter soil. I've made my own in the past. I made my own because I'm cheap, because I know seed starting soil is not cheap. We're talking about in these containers, you need 3 to 4 inches inside of each. So that adds up, especially when you're getting very light soil that comes in expensive small patches.
We have a planting out question as well. This is with Joe Pyeweed and whether a gardener would need to clear the space around plants to introduce Joe Pyeweed into the mix.
So that's a Joe Pyeweed question, and I'm not a Joe Pyeweed expert. I love Joe Pyeweed though. I actually don't know who Joe Pye was and would love to know. But from my experience, Joe Pyeweed needs a lot of space. So I would allow for some space. Yes.
If you have something in a container, what are your thoughts about placing that container on a raised bed instead of on the ground? So where, like the location of your containers.
That's fine.
So placing it on top of a raised bed is okay.
Yes. So I wanted to show here some of the experiments that we've done as master gardeners with winter sowing and the success we had. You can see alone by this picture that our success has been very good. In this instance, we seeded a gallon with in January, and we were able to start planting seedlings in late March, and we were able to fill up an entire 4 by 12 bed off of one jug of spinach seeds. You can see when they first come out, they're small, but they grow strong and they grow well. So the end result by May is that they were able to harvest a lot of spinach for donation. The same thing with collard greens, almost exactly. Sowed them in January, began planting them in late March, and were able to fill the entire bed. And by May, they were producing big, healthy plants for collard greens. This is at Arlington Central Library, which contributes to a food bank. And this particular experiment was using Swiss chard. And I did mention the Swiss chard is sensitive, but you can always try it and see what happens. And in this case, they did. And those seedlings survived as babies. I would say, from my experience, Swiss chard, as it gets older, Swiss chard does not like to be moved. As babies, they're more open to the idea of moving from one place to another. So this is our friend Puin, and you can see that the garden completely filled up by April 5th. This particular slide really goes to the extent of how well do you want to keep records. The person that kept records for this particular experiment wanted to know exactly and wanted to keep good data. I did keep a journal of how well my plants did, but not to this degree. So it depends on how you want to track your success with winter sowing, is to what degree you want to record how things are going and at what plants did well. I can tell you from my own experiments, I would say that 8 out of 10 winter sown containers did not do well, but I used old seed. So I always wanted to push my luck with the oldest seed possible, but was always ready for at least some of them not to do well. The person that popularized winter sowing is Trudy Davidoff, and here is her website along with other educational resources on winter sowing practices. I would say, looking at the bottom picture, that those plants need water. And this is just a picture that I would always love to see, is to go out on my back patio and see all these plants ready to go into my garden that cost me almost nothing but my time and a lot of milk jugs. And that's probably about it. We have additional library garden talk and classes that we encourage you to go to. We have written resources. We have our organic vegetable demonstration garden along with others. We ask that if you have the time and inclination, that you volunteer, especially at a garden that gives to the less fortunate, and for you, just like me and other master gardeners, to garden fearlessly. Always be okay with experimenting. Be okay with a disaster occurring. You always regrow, and it's nice to talk to you and be in the company of people that like to garden as much as I do. Thank you. Any last questions?
Yes, we have a few questions here. Two were about the chart that you showed a few slides back, which I believe is not your chart, correct? That is someone else's notes.
That is someone else's notes. She was my mentor and my inspiration.
So one was about whether if these notes were from an 8A zone, like if
Yes, but we used to be 7B.
right,
We're
and this
on,
is from 2018, so it may have
yeah,
been 7B back
maybe.
then.
Yeah, we've gotten warmer since then.
And then another question was whether fertilizer was used during this process.
When you're starting seed, they do not need to be fertilized in the beginning. When you're ready to transplant them, that's when you're saying, okay, I provide you your final home, and now I'm going to fertilize you and make sure that you have the best experience possible to grow into maturity. But starting from seed, no, they just need light, warmth, good soil, and at the right depth. Worry about fertilizer later.
The last question regarding this chart was about the spacing of the transplant, and I guess it seems a little tight maybe compared to some other recommendations. And so just if you had any thoughts on that.
Yes. Well, opinions vary. I agree that using the brownie method is tighter, that I'm willing to see how those plants do and take away plants that aren't doing as well. That might even make me lazy because I'm less apt to want to, especially if there's a lot of plants in there, do one by one. Okay. But I can tell you that in looking at this, that these plants were taken out of their winter sown container one by one and put in. The same thing with these and these. It's preference.
Sure. Preference, experience, your
Yeah.
specific site. I mean, lots of things.
Yes.
One question is about tomatoes and Mother's Day, and I guess it's a rule of thumb that this gardener knows of putting out your tomatoes after Mother's Day or planting them
hmm
out. And so if your goal is to plant out using that as your benchmark, when should you start winter sowing?
4 to 6 weeks earlier. But that is considered a tender vegetable. It does not accept frost in any way. So you can start them earlier than that, but you're going to have to keep an eye on them. And here's the payoff. You're going to get tomatoes earlier and you're going to get stronger plants when using this method. It's always sad to me that I have to wait until beginning of July to start picking tomatoes. So experiment, but protect tomatoes from frost.
One is about crushed eggshells and whether they need to be disinfected before being placed on the soil.
No, we're talking about biologic matter. It's all part of the earth. I would just crush them and I wouldn't do anything special.
One more question is about storing seed and whether you have a, I guess, preferred way that you like to do it.
I keep them out of extremes in warm or cold. I keep my seeds indoors in a drawer. You're going to think I'm crazy, but I buy seeds that are packaged for 25 years because I'm a closet survivalist. And so I'm always worried about will I be able to grow something in the end times, which I'm sure amuses some people. But normally speaking, I just keep them in a drawer and I look at the dates because remember I gave that chart earlier that says these are good 3 to 1 years. And even then, doesn't mean that all of them are going to die after 3 years. It means that they're just going to stop being as fertile when you put them in the ground. I grew 10-year-old carrot seeds. I got at least 50% germination, but I didn't winter sow them because they're taproots.
Good way to stay on message, Jasmine. Um,
That's right.
Another question is about just as going back to the containers and the jugs. So when do you unseal them?
When my garden is ready and the plants are too. I know when my garden is ready for planting. That means that my containers have plants with true seeds in them, not just babies. That the plants that are warm related, I'm planting after the last frost date. The ones that can take a little frost and have true leaves are cool related plants I'm planting earlier in my garden directly. It's all about timing and what the plant can tolerate and whether it's ready to be transplanted.
I think this might be our last question. If you're doing a container garden already, can you start your seed in a smaller container that's within that larger, like the ultimate container?
With a
It's
top or a
yeah.
cloche or some type of covering, yeah, you're making your own greenhouse out of that.
Okay. Thank you, Jasmine.
Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you so much to everyone else for joining us. I thought this was a super informative session. I hope everyone else did as well. You can also go to our website to see some our upcoming class schedule. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to Jasmine for being a great presenter. Have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you.